Hello everyone and welcome to Much Better People. I'm your host Soumya and this podcast is all about those transitions in life, but especially the ones that are, kicking your ass a little bit more than others. Each week I'll be joined by a new guest to discuss their loves and losses, generally in their 20s, and then think about the lessons that they've learned and that they'll bring forward into their 30s and onwards. So if you need to know a little bit more about the concept of the podcast and especially where the name comes from, Much Better People, there is a story behind that which should hopefully make you laugh, and you can listen to that on whichever platform you're on. So my guest today is a really dear friend of mine, Priya, and I asked her to come on because I felt like she just had so much to share that would be really thought-provoking. Now, Priya to me is just unapologetically herself. She's fierce, funny, an absolute firecracker of a person, and that's why we love her. But actually, she has this other side, which I find really, really lovely and interesting. And if you think about the phrase duality of man, that's how I think about Priya, sort of duality of woman. She's astoundingly astute. She's really intelligent and reflective. And I think that allows her to be such a kind person and such an interesting person. So Priya, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a real honour to be asked. And that was such a lovely introduction. It was the best introduction I've ever had.
I know. Well, I'm hyping you up because you agreed to go on this podcast that no one knows about. Which is fantastic. So today's episode centres obviously around a few different things that are linked to love and loss and lessons. But what really struck me around your episode is that we're thinking about trauma and thinking about it in a more holistic way. So I, was really sort of interested to hear you talk about certain books you've been reading up about in terms of your own trauma and how you work through that. You work in clinical genetics, so you've got this real science mind to you. But then you're also really thinking about spirituality and the body. So I understand as well that you're training to be a breathwork practitioner, which is really interesting.
I am, yeah. I really loved your use of the word duality in that introduction because I think that really sums up where I'm at in life at the moment. So, a bit of context for the podcast, just turned 30. I had the usual midlife crisis. It was great, really thought-provoking. And I'm at a position at the moment where, I work in clinical genetics. I've always been a bit of a science bitch, always loved science. Did double science at GCSE.
Oh, right, show off.
So look at me go. Science at A-level, it's all been about science for me. And then throughout my 20s, I had a few experiences that essentially led me to discovering the root cause of trauma, and that then led me down a path that I would essentially call us a path of spirituality. Somatic experiencing is another word I think I use a lot in this area as well, and it's essentially almost the antithesis of science. And it's been a really beautiful journey, very difficult sometimes. I'll touch on trauma at some point. It's just it's a really amazing point.
It was really interesting when you used the word somatic because obviously in genetics, when we think about, science and things around that being somatic, things that have occurred following conception. And it was really interesting to see that term is also used within breathwork. So can you tell me a little bit more about what it means in breathwork?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating because in my day job, when I'm working at the hospital, I'm specialising in cancer at the moment. So we talk about somatic and sort of the things that happen to our genes after we've been born that increase the risk of developing cancer. In the world of sort of trauma, breathwork, and I guess that sort of spiritual examination of what it means to be a human being, somatic means to sort of exist within the body. So core theory of new trauma research is that trauma is previously seen as a thought problem, essentially a cognitive dissonance. Now we understand that trauma is stored in the body, and that the key theory behind trauma is actually talking about the traumatic event just serves to re-traumatise that person. There is no therapeutic value, there is some therapeutic value to recounting the experience once, maybe twice, but not to keep talking about it. And actually, in order to really cure trauma, you have to tap into the places in the body in which it's stored. And there's lots of different ways to do that. I came across breathwork last year I'd experienced quite a big heartbreak, and you know that feeling when it is just unbearable. Heartbreak's the worst, isn't it? It doesn't matter how many times you've had it, it's just unbearable. And
I created a podcast.
Yeah, there you go, yeah.
Yeah.
It's mad 'cause it's such a ubiquitous human experience, and yet it is so unbelievably painful. I didn't know what to do with myself, and I'd come across breathwork, and I did one session, and I've never experienced such a sort of transformation or release of that pain. I think especially in our society, a lot of the time when we have an emotion, we're sort of talking to someone about that, you know, saying to you, I feel heartbroken, but none of that emotion is actually being expressed. It's sort of like I'm processing it cognitively. And the process of breath work allowed me to sort of tap into where that was being stored in my body, and to release it. And it was just really transformative experience, because rather than feeling the absolute anger that I felt towards that person, I could sum up a huge amount of compassion and what I would call sort of unconditional love. And I could, you know, rather than sort of hating on him, really see the sort of the position he was in. And the transformation was just so huge that I was like, right, this is the shit. This is the shit. Like, I need to like get into this a lot more. And this journey has sort of taken me down lots of different paths that have finding ways to tap into the way that trauma, so essentially sort of like traumatic memories are stored in the body. So the theory behind that is, you know, I think it's something that humans love to deny. We love to pretend that we're not animals, and we absolutely are. We love to think that we're kind of, a much, much higher, like completely different class. The idea of trauma is that when we experience something that is stressful, and I think trauma is often mistakenly assigned to big, horrible experiences such as like war or rape, or witnessing a murder. And actually what it means from a somatic perspective essentially is that your body went into the fight or flight response, and that could be anything. That could be a parent shouting at you when you were a child, anything that sets you off. And if the process of coming out of the flight or fight response is interrupted in any way, so for instance, if you are scared but the social environment you're in means that you have to pretend to not be scared, it's like our cognitive brain overrides the I love calling it the lizard brain, that part of our brain that just like from when we were lizards. The lizard brain is in charge of fight or flight. We now know that it's actually fight, flight, freeze or fawn response. There are 4 versions of that. The traditional kind of perspective is looking at fight or flight, and that comes from our lizard brain. That's sort of part of that evolutionary pathway. We're obviously a lot more advanced now. We're reaching into the stage of human evolution where we use a lot of our prefrontal cortex, and the way those 2 parts of the brain interact with each other is that our prefrontal cortex can override these sort of very animalistic responses. But what that does is it means that we don't fully discharge the energy that sort of comes into our body when we're getting ready to run away from a lion. And your mum when you're 4 and you've spilt some juice on the floor isn't a lion, but our fight or flight system, I mean, everyone has experienced that. Mums can be terrifying. It's just been a really, really fascinating sort of exploration down that. So to come back to the somatic part, that energy that we would usually use to fight or flee gets stuck in our body, and if we don't discharge it, that builds up over time, and that's where the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder come in.
Okay, yeah, so that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think probably a lot of people that are listening can relate to that, because what I found really interesting, around what you said, it doesn't always have to be a really huge event that unanimously everybody would agree is traumatic, and I suppose it differs naturally for different people. So I think it's really important to understand that these small interactions or reactions count as trauma, and if you don't ever kind of address them or acknowledge them, then your body will. And I think what's interesting for me is that I started suffering with migraines following a few kind of sort of big and negative life events that came all together. I never made the connection, which is just bizarre. And when you're talking about breath work or becoming a practitioner in that area, it really struck me as quite similar to humanistic therapy or theory and Gestalt theory, because my therapist works from that arena, and she's very much around connecting, what's happening with your body in that moment. with your words. And I'm so guilty of just not making that connection. I suppose I'm not blaming myself, but you've got to learn it, and it's not something that you are taught. So it's really interesting as well speaking to you, because like you said to me earlier, you apply, scientific concepts on a kind of daily basis. But there was this part of processing trauma that you couldn't assign to science or the mind or those kind of cognitive things. And so that's when you started to think about what's the rest of the picture, what's going to be sort of something that ties it up. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that, but when you think about, I guess, just generally people in society, what struck me is that you were speaking about this kind of, so for example, you spill a glass of milk, your dad, your mum, whoever screams at you, you internalise that because you don't want to maybe further exacerbate the situation. So instead of just maybe shaking or cry, just kind of letting that emotion out, some people, it wouldn't feel safe to do that in the moment. And I was thinking about men and women. So there is quite a large expectation on men in society, especially when it comes to not expressing certain emotions. So do you see any differences, or have you seen any differences in your work so far around that?
It's a really, really good question. Yeah, I think the way in which society tells men and women to behave in order to conform to what, men and women should be doing in our society does mean that trauma comes out in lots of different ways. So when expressing emotion, obviously anger is a lot more acceptable for men to be angry than it is for women. It's also sort of quite encouraged in some scenarios. So emotional discharge often comes out in that way with men, and with women it can often come out in sort of more emotional ways. But it tends to be, I think that's quite a general rule. Individually, it can come out in lots and lots of different ways. And especially in my family, the anger lives more in the women in our family than it does the men. The men tend to be less angry, and so it really comes out in anger in the women in our family. So as a general rule, I think there is a bit of variation
of course,
in that.
Individual differences. That's really fascinating actually. So when thinking, I suppose, about the concept of this podcast and losses in your 20s, would you be able to tell me a little bit more about what you feel you may have lost during that time period, if anything?
Definitely. I think there was a really key moment in my 20s. I'm sort of interpreting this. There was loss of sort of people in my life. There was loss of, I think, a lot of experiences that I could have had because I was carrying so much trauma. A real moment for me was starting out in the field of clinical genetics, having, completed the masters, graduated, got a job, and I thought that would sort of be the point in which, everything fell into place and was fine. I've got a good understanding of human genetics. And I was experiencing very difficult physical symptoms constantly. I mean, you talked a little bit about migraines earlier, so I was starting to get migraines, extreme fatigue, chronic pain, and the most difficult one was, sorry, laugh about this, you just have to, just throwing up all the time. And I'd been going to doctors. I'd started going to doctors from about the age of 22 with these symptoms, and it got to around the age of 26, and I had a particularly stressful period at work. We were publishing a paper. I was sort of in the run-up to that, trying to get it published on time. We knew there was a rival group kind of publishing something similar, so we were all systems go. And cognitively in my brain, I was like, this is so exciting. I'm at the forefront of the most incredible research. I'm working at a really prestigious hospital in London. And I was getting on the train to go into work every day, and my body was freaking out. It was like I was asking it to, go and fight 20 tigers. I was throwing up every morning, getting really bad chronic pain, absolutely exhausted. I could sleep for 12, 13 hours and not feel rested afterwards. And I was just at the end of my tether. We had tried so I'd had every test going on the NHS. I had all sorts of investigations. I couldn't find anything functionally wrong with me. I was incredibly lucky enough. So my aunt is a PTSD counsellor for first responders to 9/11. She's an incredible woman, absolutely amazing. And she said to me, you need to take a couple of weeks off work. buy the book, The Body Keeps the Score, sit down with it, read it, take your time. And I realised that the experience of trauma had left me so separate from my body. I felt like my body just kept letting me down. When I wanted to get up and go to work and do this research and publish a paper and see my patients, it was just doing absolutely, it was like a child throwing its toys out of the pram, absolutely anything it could to get me to stop and rest. And we were just sort of, it was like my self, my cognitive self and my body were at loggerheads. There was no communication between myself and my body at all. I wasn't listening. And I remember having a moment, I was really weird around that time, inexplicably developed a fear of the dark at the age of 26. And I think it was one I was like, what the hell is going on? That's not cool, is it?
Really not cool, Priya.
Admitted that to the whole world. My body was freaking out. I was basically like, right, something is going on here. I've achieved everything that I've wanted to academically, and I wasn't happy. I wasn't functioning well. I didn't feel sort of present and alive. And I was just dealing with so many symptoms that was just really keeping me back. And I had a moment that started reading the book, The Body Keeps the Score, and realising actually the severity that trauma had on myself. I remember whispering to myself, this sounds a bit mad, whispering to my body, essentially, that I promise I'm going to start listening to you from now on. And that was sort of the beginning of a massive change for me. So realising how much I'd lost out on, not realising being constantly in fight or flight mode, which is what complex PTSD is, meant that I just was not present in my life at all. I'd sort of achieved a lot at that point and wasn't able to enjoy any of it. And was, really not having a good time. That was 4 years ago now, and it's been a really, really tricky experience. And I just so really coming to terms with the loss of just being present in life. Actually, a loss of connection. I think a big thing that we don't talk about in trauma is it's really hard to feel connected to the loved ones in your life when you are experiencing trauma symptoms, because you just constantly feel unsafe. And when you feel unsafe, you can't be vulnerable. When you can't be vulnerable, you lose connection. So that was a real turning moment for me when I realised that I just really had to start listen to my body and get back into it. And that was really when the work came in. But that was quite a devastating moment for me, because I'd felt like I'd worked so hard academically to get where I was at, and it was obvious. So through my own academic studies, there was nothing that I was reading about, no understanding in genetics about trauma. I'd been a patient myself. It's quite an interesting dynamic, sort of being a healthcare provider within the NHS and also being a patient. And essentially Western medicine couldn't do anything for me. I had a really good doctor at the time, a GP. He just sort of said to me, look, the NHS is great if you're like almost dead or seriously ill. For these kind of conditions, you need to be looking a bit more holistically. So I had a few sort of voices in my life at that time that said, it's just not, Western medicine just isn't enough, and you're going to have to start delving into something else. In my own head, I kind of call it sort of spirituality. A lot of it's just sort of understanding trauma, and that there is a very scientific element to that. I talked a little bit before about the sort of prefrontal cortex, the lizard brain, and then there's like the midbrain or like the mammalian brain. So having a science background really helped with that. But you can't think your way out of trauma. You have to feel your way out of it. And that was quite a devastating realisation to me, because I had such a bad relationship with my body that I knew that I had to kind of rekindle that and start listening to it before I could process the trauma.
Thank you for sharing that. That's, I think, like I said before as well, lots of people can relate to this. And actually, maybe some people listening to this haven't made that connection either, and this might help with that. But it's definitely one of those things where when you're sort of younger and in your earlier 20s, your body is just so much better as well. I'm calling you old. At just compensating and managing. And, once you start to realise that actually you have to look after it, and you can't always control it either. That's a real turning point for other people that I've spoken to about things that are quite similar. So chronic health, you mentioned as an example. Sorry,
I'd love a bit of chronic health. That'd be great, wouldn't it?
Chronic. Where do they sell that? I'd buy that. Chronic pain is one that's really fascinating, because often, there's no real, there's no real answer for that. But obviously, if you're experiencing it, it's there, So how do you manage that? And I think, breathwork sounds like a way to kind of come to that in a different way, but still have something relatively concrete to do. So I don't know if you can tell me as well, I know you touched on it earlier, but for example, it sounds quite like airy and a bit hippie-ish and,
It's so woo-woo.
So typically, how would you approach a breathwork session?
First of all, you kind of have to set the scene. I think it's something we're so not used to doing in sort of Western culture, where you were like really getting into your body. I'd say it's kind of like similar to yoga in some ways, but a lot more extreme. So I'd spend, depending on whether I was doing it with a one-on-one with one person or with a group, you spend the first sort of 10 minutes orientating people to it. And for me, this is really important, because when I first started with breathwork, I managed to do probably about 20 seconds before my body went into full flight or fight mode. I was like ready to just run out of the room, you just go completely into panic. I had a really great practitioner with me who could sort of sit here. He's like, all you need to do is just stay here, like stop doing the breath work, stop doing the breathing, just try and be in your body and not run. And so for me, it's really important to kind of warn people that a lot can come up. I mean, when you sort of sitting with breathwork sessions, you get people hysterically crying, hysterically laughing, like full body shaking. It's really it's just so animalistic, and it's this real sort of like taking us out of our thinking brains and just back into the body again. So it's sort of a combination of breathing techniques that help sort of get your body. I mean, first thing it does is kind of really flood the brain with oxygen. You're sort of getting in as much breath as you possibly can. It also kind of changes things in your body neurobiologically that allow somatic sort of experiencing to come through. Basically anything that just quietens the thinking part of our brain and accesses more of this sort of the animal side, so the mammalian brain and the lizard brain, and allows us to kind of allow that trauma that's stored up to come out. So that's what answers your question.
It does answer my question. I don't know if you'll get me to it, because I'm British, so I'm probably not going to do that.
It's incredible, really, to watch people get back into the sort of animal bodies to the extent that they do with that practice.
Yeah, that is interesting, sorry. So talking about, I guess, repression, repressing things, obviously it sounds like that's clearly something that you had been doing. Mm-hmm. And again, I just think that's a really universal experience, because we're just trying to protect ourselves. So yeah, once people, I suppose, are ready to accept help, that's really important. Because again, I probably for about a year or so just really didn't want to face any of it. So my body was like, right, okay, you're not going to process this. I'm going to process it for you. So here's migraines. And my first experience with something a bit more extreme in terms of health was I was at work and I was walking through the corridors, and literally, so I work in a hospital too, and the signs up on the doors and stuff like that, the words just started to disappear. So I just thought, oh, I'm mad. Great. Fantastic, it's finally happened. I'm just insane.
Here we go. Off we go.
Don't know how PC that is, but yeah, no, I'm crazy. But then I actually did really start to freak out, because my vision just started tunneling in. I got back to my office and I sat there and I was just like, I can't see. And it was bizarre. And I went into one of my manager's offices, and they're all fantastic, and they were just looking at me like, oh God. So one of them physically had to come down in the lift with me to the A&E. And I'm just there like, this is it. This is the end for me. What have I done with my life? Nothing. Thinking it's just something, just off the scale awful. And thankfully I was very fortunate that it was what they call kind of ocular migraines, or migraines with a kind of an ocular presence to them. So I started to feel like I was losing my vision. But it's insane that I had repressed so much emotion, really needed to have just come out, whether that was screaming, crying, laughing, whatever it was, shake, I don't know, like who knows. I wasn't doing that because I was still just trying to go to work. It was through a pandemic. I had shit to do. I had patients to work with and look after. I was like, I don't have time to sit at home and cry, but I really should have. And so yeah, I was just kind of confronted with what was going on internally with something external. And I'd never had migraines before, so it was really interesting to think about the part of the body that I experienced that kind of like confrontation in, I suppose, as well. So yeah, thank you for kind of speaking about your diagnosis and what's helped for you as well. So your loss really is around, like you said, that loss of connection and kind of loss of opportunity is what I heard. Absolutely. Because the earlier you acknowledge these things and, you know, have time to kind of process them, then you can just be so much more present in lots of the areas. And can I just say, you've done a fantastic job anyway of being present, because you're unstoppable now. It'd be coming for my job. So that's great. I guess moving forward a little bit, and the concept for this podcast, I'm talking about love as well, because I just think love comes in so many different forms, and it can be messy and just so wonderful, but also inherently comes with pain. So for you, what would you say as kind of one of your great loves in your 20s?
I'm going to branch out a little bit. I've definitely had some incredible romantic loves. I was with my one partner for a couple of years, and they are my best friend now. We're separated, have been for a few years. They now have a new partner and a baby together, and we've worked quite hard on sort of maintaining a friendship, and that's one of the most special things to me. And it was so beautiful. We were friends beforehand, friends for about 4 years, engaged in a romantic relationship, and are now sort of best friends afterwards as well. And they are been one of the most incredible presents in my life. I'm incredibly blessed to have them. That's Yasha. Hey.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, that's really unique that you were able to transition through all those types of relationships with Yasha, from friends to lovers, to not to enemies, then friends again. Yeah. That's very, very unique. So that type of love that you have with her and what you've just mentioned kind of is really rare. Yeah,
really rare. Really, really lucky to have that. And I think if we're talking about love, I'd have to shout out my dog, Cleo. Who is the absolute love of my life. Yeah. Nothing brings me joy like seeing her silly little face in the morning, the way she wags her little tail, like all of her mannerisms. She's been amazing, really. I think she's been a really key part of this kind of journey of healing from trauma. Yeah. Because she's very boundaried as an animal. She's taught me a lot around being slow, being present. Dogs are fantastic for that. She can sit in the garden and just like stare at a leaf for 15 minutes. I think a symptom of trauma that we often don't recognise is this busyness, like constantly needing to be busy, because you can't just sort of sit with your bodily sensations. Anytime you have a moment of rest where your body, your mind is quiet enough for your body to start communicating with you, you start doing things to not feel that. And that was like a chronic thing of mine throughout the 20s as well, like doing absolutely everything as much as possible, constantly keeping myself busy and not being able to sit and feel. And I think dogs and cats are really good leaders in that, just sitting and being present, eating, walking, like feeling joy, playing, just really like coming back to basics. I've talked a lot about sort of returning to our animal selves, and I think having an animal in your life is a really, really good way of being able to tap into that. She absolutely is the love of my life. I think also really important to shout out to platonic loves. I think we don't give it enough credit in our society. You know, books, films, is all a lot around romantic love, and that kind of actually what can sometimes be depicted in what I think is quite an abusive way. I think we have quite a toxic idea of romantic love, the kind of idea that you need someone to be complete. Actually, we are all complete the way that we are. We have everything we need within ourselves, and I think we are our own best healer. And I think that platonic loves are a really great way of facilitating that, because they are often not so codependent. They of course absolutely can be, but having, especially for me, some of the women I have in my life, and Yasha being non-binary, have been incredible sort of anchors. I've learned so much from my friends. They've supported me through sort of the hardest times. I just massive shout out for platonic love.
Yeah, I think that's again something that's probably quite universal. It's something that I've experienced, because I've always sort of been, in my 20s, I was in 2 big relationships that lasted 4.5 to 5 years each. And I always felt like I was a very independent person within those romantic relationships. But actually, I don't think I truly had the opportunity to know that because I hadn't just physically been alone. So yeah, over these past couple of years, you know, and thinking about my friends and my family and the people that have been around me through a very difficult time, it's just so incredible to see just how important, you know, those connections are. And actually to also think about the fact that yes, I can have all these different types of loves in my life, you know, familial love, like you said, platonic love with friends, and just overwhelming love for my cat because I'm obsessed with him. He could literally just like try and kill me and I'd be like, it's okay, you were having a bad day. But then I have had such an intense experience of romantic love at a very young age, and that of course has shaped me, but I've always maintained this kind of independence. And I think with your friends, like you said, it's usually less, use the word toxic, because, you know, when you kind of take the kind of sexual side out of things, it does chill those relationships out, depending on how you use them. And so, yeah, I think, like you said, platonic love is just really important, because your friends are there for you, you know, no matter how you're presenting.
Absolutely. I think ego is a big thing. I think we often expect our partners to sort of be a public sort of statement of who we are. There's like an ego element there. It's like when you're out and about with your partner, the way that they behave and speak, you feel is a direct reflection on you. Whereas, yeah, I think often with friendships, that's not always so much the case. I mean, I don't know about you, but my friends are horrible little gremlin freaks, and I love them so much because of that. It's like there's no kind of like showiness around it. They can be really genuine, really honest. I have a concept in one of my friendship groups about the goblin friend. So you're thinking about like the mum friend, or like the, you know, the kind of the wild friend, but actually then you've got the goblin friend that's just massively underrated, the one that like loves gross shit. Like trackies absolutely is a look. Yep. Like it eats all the time, like there's just piles of stuff everywhere. Just like that kind of that level of comfort and authenticity with people where you can be a grotty little rat bag. So much love for grotty little rat bags.
Yeah, that's my cat. He's my goblin friend. Also, I can think of a few other people like that.
I'm really lucky in a couple of relationships I've had were friendships first. So I'm in a relationship at the moment, and I think the beauty of that has come from the fact that we were friends for so long, and we completely just accept each other how we come. And yeah, there's just that kind of like patience and acceptance. I was just telling you, so on the first day, I was a horrible brat. I didn't talk to him for the first 10 minutes because he was like 3 minutes late, and then cried on the tube for the entire journey on the way home because I got too drunk. And then the next day, he was trying to leave, and I was like, absolutely not, he's taking me out for breakfast. Which you wouldn't have never done if I was just on a normal date, but because it's your friend, there's that level of authenticity, and it's just kind of blossomed from there. Yeah, there's a real beauty in that.
Yeah, it sounds good. Maybe I need some more male friends. I don't know. Great. So the last thing, I suppose, is to think about lessons that you've learned from your 20s. You know, a really small task. Not hard at all.
Oh, God, the lessons.
Or lesson. What do you feel, I suppose, it's going to serve you quite well going into your 30s now?
The biggest lesson I learned from my 20s, I think when I was frantically looking outside of myself for answers to why I didn't feel happy or felt out of place or felt so stressed all the time, asking other people's opinions a lot. You know, a lot of my existence was very external. So the biggest lesson that I have learned in my 20s through, you know, processing trauma, working through trauma, is that actually myself and every single person out there, everybody has everything they need within them to heal themselves. And actually we are our own best healer. And I think you've got to be on your own side, talking to my body and sort of saying, you know, let's work together. I always feel really bad when I talk about that. Let's work together, you know, let's be a team. I'm going to listen to you. If you're saying to me you need to rest, I will rest. If you're saying, you know, eat, I will eat. A researcher I really love, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves. It's a great book, everybody read it. She is a really lovely example of, like, if a friend came to your house and said, I want a glass of water, you wouldn't say, I'm busy. like, can you wait? I think actually just, really like hunkering down and knowing that you have everything you need within yourself was the greatest lesson that I've learned. I feel like I've only just learned that, and there's going to be so much more to tap into it, but it makes me feel very excited for the next decade of my life, for my 30s, to kind of like really come back to myself, to trust myself, to know myself, to love myself, and to know that I have everything I need.
It's amazing. You're doing my job for me. That was such a good ending.
I've come out with a lot of shit, and every now and then I can be quite profound. It was a prophecy. You set me up for that with that introduction at the beginning.
I know, and I didn't plan it, it came from the heart. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody that's been listening. That's Priya's episode. We've explored a lot there, and sometimes talking about trauma, obviously, can bring up things for people that are not very pleasant. So if you do need any kind of support and things like that, I hope you reach out to friends and family that are trusted, and any other resources that are available. And I know that the Samaritans are a great one because I used to volunteer for them, and I feel like that's fine for me to say because they are very, very trusted and there for you, whether you're feeling kind of despair. So please do reach out if you need to. And the only other thing to say is that this is quite a new podcast, so I am always looking for people who are interested in coming on and being very reflective and open with me. So if you see yourself having a conversation with me, please contact me using the links in the bio. And thanks again for listening. And I guess all I would say is protect your peace. And till next time. Thank you. Bye.